Hi everyone, and thanks for watching. My name's Mike Preston, and I'm a Senior Developer Advocate here at Rubric. And today I want to walk you through some of the awesome functionality that we have within Rubric to protect your AWS environment. So to kind of lay out how the presentation is going to go today, for those of you who might not know who Rubric is or what we do, I'll first start off with a quick sort of intro as to what Rubric does. From there, we'll dive into exactly how our AWS protection works. We'll go through the ins and outs of how we protect your EC2 instances as well as your RDS instances. And of course, seeing's believing. So we'll jump into a demo so I can show you just how easy and simplistic it is to use Rubric to go from basically zero to fully protected within your AWS environment. After that, we'll wrap up and we'll have you on your way. So to start, let me talk a little bit about who Rubric is and how we got here. Basically, we're a data management and data protection company, and we provide these capabilities through a single software fabric that really extends from your on-prem to edge to cloud. And the easiest way to kind of explain what we do is to talk a little bit about our pillars and our components and how we actually developed and architected our platform. So really at the core is the ability to modernize and automate. And there's several unique things we have that support that. So the first is going to be SLA automation. Essentially, we take those thousands of jobs that legacy vendors usually have in pertains to backup, like jobs to backup, jobs to replicate, jobs to index, and we really boil that down into a few simple, easy to use SLA policies. And we'll dive more into this on the next slide because it's a super important piece and a really big differentiator for Rubric. Second, with Rubric, we can recover very quickly. We automate the process and orchestrate a lot of the recovery capabilities that you need in order to get up and running quickly. Thirdly, we're an API-first company. We provide basically everything that can be done within the UI can be done as well by an underlying API. And this is what your cloud architects are probably looking for as they look to integrate their data management into solution tool sets like Terraform and Ansible and all of that stuff. And lastly, Rubric is secure, right? Security is at our heart. Once data is written, once backups are taken with Rubric, they can never be changed. And this is what we call immutability. And basically, this provides great strengths as it pertains to protecting against things like ransomware. So we take this policy-driven approach and we bundle this up and we basically apply these policies to all of your workloads. So whether they be on-prem, like shown below here, basically your VMwares, your SQLs, your Oracles, your physical Windows, or whether they be in the cloud as well. So think EC2 instances or RDS. We apply these SLA domain policies to them. We begin to back up your data, but the thing is we don't just back up your data, we process and analyze metadata around your data as well. So we understand the where and the why and the how of your data. And this really is another key differentiator for Rubric because we can take this metadata and essentially build on top of that and let you do more with your data. So we built applications on top of our Polaris SaaS platform, which basically allow you to get more out of your backup data. The first application that we released is called Radar, and really it's a lot of AI and ML, and it takes a look at your data and can really pinpoint how your data has changed. So if ransomware hits, we can tell when that data was encrypted and provide you with a one-click recovery back to a known good state. The second application we released is called Sonar, and Sonar is really a data governance play. So think of drilling into your data and identifying, where threats may be. We can tell if you're compliant with things like HIPAA or PCI. So this is really the Rubric platform, but sitting at the heart of this is our SLA automation. Now, like I said, we've walked into a lot of customers using legacy solutions, and they have hundreds, if not thousands of jobs. Job to back up, job to replicate, job to index. And they're all chained together, and if one fails, the whole chain fails. So basically what we do is we take all of these jobs and we boil them down into a few simple, easy to use SLA domains. So what goes into a Rubric SLA domain? Well, the first those two things are going to be RPO and retention. So how often do we want to back up? and how long do we want to keep that. So maybe you want to take a backup every 6 hours, keep it for a day, take it daily, keep it for a month, and so on and so forth. All of this gets entered into the policy. Now there's a couple more things as well that a policy encapsulates. The first is archival. So let's talk about archival. So archival basically processes backups at the end of your backup chain, and it can move them off of the Rubrik platform onto more cost-effective storage. So think things like Glacier or S3. So essentially you can say, I want to keep, my most recent 30 days of backups on the Rubrik platform. That's probably what I'm going to restore in the long run. The other stuff, I'm just keeping this around for compliance reasons to make somebody happy. Let's migrate this off of the platform so I don't have to pay for this storage, and I could save a bit of money by leveraging, AWS services like Glacier. Then we get to replication. So replication is another construct within our SLA domain, and it's kind of the opposite of archival in a way. Rather than processing backups at the end of the chain, we're really looking at backups at the beginning of the chain. So think, maybe I want to take my most 5 recent backups, and I'd like to replicate them to another location, another Rubrik cluster at another location, or in terms of AWS protection, maybe I want to move these things from US East 1 to US West 2. I'm going to replicate my most 5 recent backups. That way, if we lose a region or we lose a site, our data's sitting at that other location and can be easily restored. So with a little knowledge now about how the Rubrik platform works, let's dive into exactly how we protect and manage your AWS data. Now, we can really boil this down into 3 simple sort of constructs, and I'm going to dive into each of these in a little more detail. But basically, we have the quick start, how we get configured. We then have our automated protection or our backups, and then restores. So what I want to do is sort of talk about each of these so you really understand the ins and outs of how Rubrik technically protects your data. So the first one's going to be quick start. Now, quick start's pretty simple. Rubrik Polaris is a SaaS platform. So essentially you log in and you basically give us some AWS credentials into your account. Now what we do from there is we deploy a CloudFormation template into your account, which in turn deploys all of the resources that we need in order to protect that account. So the biggest and main one is this cross-account IAM role. So this role gets created that allows us, our Rubrik AWS account, to assume a role within your environment, and it basically gives us the minimal set of permissions that we need in order just to protect your data. There's some other things we create, like an EKS cluster to scale up and down things like file indexing, and we'll talk about that as we get to it. But essentially, we leverage a CloudFormation template to deploy the resources we need, and those resources are in your account and controlled by the customer. So at any given time, you can easily just say, hey, no more access for you. So once we get in, once we're authenticated, we then get to this SLA domain policy. We go in and we quickly create an SLA domain policy, and then we assign that to our Ec2 instances or RDS instances or our individual EBS volumes. And we can assign an SLA policy to these resources in 3 different ways. 1, we can directly assign this to the resource. 2, we can assign an SLA domain to our AWS account. So that way we can provide, whole level account protection. So everything that exists within that account would in turn inherit that SLA domain. And any new resources that you might spin up will automatically pick that up and be protected. And then thirdly, we see a lot of our customers who already have this sort of established AWS tagging strategy that they have. Well, we can embed ourselves into that as well and assign SLA domains based off certain tag names or tag values. So once the resources are all assigned and we're all set up, that's when our backup starts beginning. So let's really dive into what happens when we take an AWS backup. And we'll start off with EC2 protection. So at a high level, this is basically what happens. First, Polaris authenticates into your account using a Rubrik IAM user within Rubrik's AWS account. This is customer specific. Credentials are encrypted and stored encrypted and everything's safe. So we use this Rubrik account to authenticate into your account, and then we assume that cross-account role, right? So now we have the permissions in order to do things like take snapshots. So this is where things really start moving. So first, we make the appropriate API calls into the customer's environment in order to create and expire and manage all of those EBS volume snapshots for the EC2 instances that you have set up to be protected. Secondly, if you turned on replication within the SLA domain, we'll go ahead and we'll issue copy snapshot API calls to go ahead and move that data from region to region, always adhering to the constructs of what you set up within the policy. Then, if we have file level indexing enabled, we'll spin up those Kubernetes pods in order to crack open those snapshots and actually take an index of all of the files within those EBS snapshots, so we can provide that fast global search across your environment. And finally, and this is probably most importantly, we send all that metadata back to Polaris. The data though, the snapshots, the backups, all of this stuff stays within the confines of the customer account. Only metadata gets transferred back to Polaris. So that's EC2. Let's kind of look at how RDS actually works. So it's kind of the same thing where we authenticate in, we assume that cross-account role, and then we actually make some regional API calls to a backup vault to create ourselves that little container and issue the appropriate commands to create the snapshots for your database instances. From there, we go ahead and if you have set up log backup on the SLA domain, we'll actually utilize the automated AWS backups because they contain all of the transaction logs that we need in order to provide that very, very granular level of protection. So we'll go ahead and we'll enable that if that's the case. So we have that ability to capture, right down to, I believe it's 5 minutes with AWS. From there, again, all of the backup metadata gets transferred back. All of your database instance data and backups and snapshots stays within the customer account. So that's about it for backup. Let's talk now about what really matters, because what good are backups if we can't restore them? So again, let's walk through sort of the process so you can completely understand how we work. And we'll start with EC2. Now I do want to make a note that what I'm going to walk through here is an Ec2 Instance Restore. That's where we're going to actually roll back that production Ec2 instance. We do have another option called export, which allows us to essentially create a clone, a point-in-time clone of an EC2 instance, and it doesn't affect your production instance. But this one's going to be for a restore. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and look at that point in time that you selected within Rubric Polaris, and we'll issue the commands to go ahead and take those snapshots and turn them into EBS volumes. Then we'll simply issue the command to the production EC2 instance to shut it down and detach the volumes that we're processing here. So detach the volumes on that production instance, and then simply issue the final command to go ahead and attach it to the newly restored volumes and fire that EC2 instance back up. So it's pretty simple stuff here. And then finally, if we've set up tag backup, so we've said, hey, I want to restore the tags that were on that instance at the certain point in time as well, we'll go ahead and restore all of the tags back to the production instance. Now let's kind of look at the same thing, same deal. We're going to move along, do RDS. So let's look at what happens here. So the first thing that happens is RDS APIs will get called in order to create all of the certain dependencies that we might have for a recovery. So during the recovery wizard, we can do things like create new subnet groups or select different option groups. So basically, we're going to create all of those prerequisites in order to have a successful recovery first. Then we simply call the RDS APIs to launch a new instance off of that database snapshot, because AWS doesn't support, rolling back to the actual instance. So we can't do an inline restore, but we can launch a new instance. So we'll launch a new instance with that point in time. And then finally, if we're recovering to a point in time that requires, log replay, we'll go ahead and issue the appropriate API calls in order to replay those transaction logs and, get that to the exact point in time that we specified. So I just want to stop before we get to the demo here and talk a lot, because we just talked a lot about all of the different API calls, excuse me, and all of the things, that we do. And you might be thinking, you're just calling AWS APIs. You know what? I can do that myself. And it's true, you can. However, let me lay out some reasons why our customers are actually choosing Rubrik to do this job over just leveraging legacy or cloud-provided services to do so. And the first is going to be really a matter of management, right? So cloud provider tools typically provide, a limited set of the customizable policies, and they really leave users having to create all these scripts and manage all this stuff themselves. Now, I don't know about you, but I was a customer for a good 20 years. And the last thing I want to do is sit around babysitting scripts. Essentially, you become your own data protection vendor. So Rubrik specializes in these fine-grained policies, and we also ensure that things like expired snapshots get cleaned up and deleted, and they're not going to sit there and cost you money. Secondly, the cloud-provided tools really have a strong focus on that volume level or image level backup. So they don't have the APIs in order to crack open that EBS snapshot and list the files and actually do a file level restore. Rubrik will index all these snapshots, provide you with that quick, fast, efficient global search across your entire environment, and we can do that file level restore for you. Now, thirdly, we all know that at scale, everything's going to fail, so it's always recommended practice to copy your snapshots from one region to another. That way, if the region fails, we have that data. Again, with the cloud-provided tools, we're left with manual scripting and cron jobs and things like that. Let Rubrik handle this for you. It's a simple little slider bar within the SLA domain, and all of a sudden, your most recent backups are moving from US East 1 to US West 1 without you having to lift a finger. And then lastly, as we start to manage all of this data across on-premises and across all the clouds, we have all these different tools that we have to leverage to do so. And they all are a little bit different, and they all have a little bit of different constructs. With Rubrik, we provide that global unified UI that you can learn once, basically learn how to apply an SLA domain, and away you go. You don't have to learn anything else. So with that, I really want to hopefully you got a good look, really under the hood about how exactly Rubrik orchestrates and automates your AWS environment in terms of data protection. But I'd like to jump into a demo so you could just see how easy all of this is, because there was a lot of stuff there, right? There was a lot of moving parts and a lot of things happening. But when you get into the demo, I think you'll see just how easy it is to do this within the UI. I mean, all of these things I went through are essentially boiled down to a few simple clicks. So with that, let's jump into the demo.
All right, so let's sort of set the stage here. We have a number of Ec2 instances which are running in US East 1. Now these are powering an outlet store for a fictitious company that we use quite a bit here at Rubric called Zafra Fashion Group. Also included in this application is a MySQL RDS instance, and they're basically providing services around a storefront. Now we can take a look at this. Basically, it's a simple WordPress site. And what we're going to do is basically utilize Rubrik to ensure that both the EC2 and RDS instances which are running this site are protected. Now, protecting things is fun and all, but restoring is where the magic really happens. So what we'll do is once we have it protected, we'll completely restore this application, but we'll do it in a completely different region, basically migrating the app from US East 1 to US West 2. So let's jump into Polaris and have a look. So the first thing we see here in Polaris is the main dashboard, where we get a high-level overview of really what's going on in terms of our organization's data management. We can see backup events, replication events, as well as an overview of what's protected and, more importantly, what's not protected. Now, I've already gone and added our AWS account into Polaris, but adding a new account is as simple as jumping up to the gear icon here, selecting Remote Accounts, and here we can choose to add a cloud account. Now we can basically just run through this wizard to add as many AWS accounts as we would like. So in order to protect our Zafra storefront, the first thing we will need to do is set up an SLA domain. So let's head up to SLA domains, and then we'll select to create a new SLA domain. Here we can see that policy-driven approach that we spoke of earlier. Let's say for this configuration, we'd like to take backups, say, every 4 hours and keep those for a day. Then we'll take dailies, keep those for 10 days. Then let's take a monthly and we'll keep that for 3 months. So you can see how granular we can get here, providing numerous RTO and retention policies. Clicking Show More gives us even more options in terms of granularity, such as quarterly and weekly restore points. Now, we have the option here to define backup windows along with log backups if we plan to protect RDS with this policy as well. I'll go ahead and click Next, and since we're going to want to restore to US2, I'm going to select to enable replication, and I'm going to configure these backups to replicate to the US West 2 region. This will basically replicate the most 3 recent backups over to US West 2. This helps protect us against things like regional level outages, and in our case, will ensure that the data is already in US West 2 in the event that we want to restore. Now, keep in mind, this isn't required. We can restore to any AWS region without enabling replication. This will just basically save us some time of having to copy those EC2 snapshots to another region. In the end, lowering our RTO. All right, so this looks good. Let's go ahead and give this a name, and we're off. So now we need to assign this newly created SLA domain to our infrastructure resources. So let's go ahead and click this button here, and we can see our inventory. Now we're interested right now in EC2, so let's drill down into EC2. And here we can see all of our EC2 instances across all regions and all of our AWS accounts. So let's drill down a bit more to limit what we see. Now first, I know these instances are in US East 1, as well as I want to filter by my Rubric-TM account, so I'll select to do that. I can also simply search within the predictive search box here in the top right to limit what's shown. So as far as assigning the SLA domain here, we have a few options. We could manually select our instances here and then click Manage Protection to directly assign an SLA domain to them. Or if we were looking to provide something like account level protection, we can select our entire AWS account and assign the SLA domain to that. That way, all existing and any new instances that appear would automatically inherit that SLA domain and essentially be automatically protected. The final option here to assign SLA domains is through something we call tag rules. Now this basically allows us to assign SLA domains to resources based off the tags within AWS. Organizations usually have some sort of tagging strategy when it comes to managing their AWS resources, and Rubric can embed itself into that strategy to provide data protection as well. So let's go ahead and create a new tag rule. We'll basically give it a name, and then we'll define what tag we want to utilize. In this case, I'll say look for anything that has an environment tag, which is set to prod. I'll select the appropriate account that I want to apply this policy to. We could apply a tag rule across multiple accounts if we wanted to. Then I'll simply click Next. Now, we simply map this to our newly created SLA domain that we just made, and we're good to go. Anything with an environment tag set to prod will now be automatically assigned to our created SLA domain. Now, if we jump back to take a look at our instances here, we can see that they're all still set to unassigned. So let's get back into our AWS console and have a look at the actual tags for these instances. Here we can see that they do have an environment tag, however, its value is set to test, so they aren't being applied to our tag rule. Now, we could change all of these manually. However, I happen to know that this entire infrastructure was deployed through Terraform. So let's dive into VS Code and make the required changes within our infrastructure as code. All right, so I can jump into the locals file here and basically modify our tag variable as every Terraform resource is reading from this file. So I'll simply change our environment tag to prod, and I'll save this file. Now, if we look at the main TF file, we can see that each of the resources being created, the EC2 instances, our RDS instance, they're simply reading from that local.tags variable. So we should be good to go in terms of updating this now. We'll go ahead and we'll run a Terraform plan, make sure we aren't doing anything wild and crazy. And we can see that it is indeed going to simply change or modify the 8 resources that we have. So let's go ahead and apply this code now. Okay, the code's been ran. Let's take a quick look within AWS to make sure it updated. And we can indeed see that our environment tag is now set to prod on our instances. If we jump back into Rubric Polaris, we can also see our instances are now part of our newly created SLA domain. Drilling down into one here and taking a look at the events, we can see that the backups have already begun for us, all based off that one tag rule that we created. So, with our EC2 instances out of the way, let's head back into inventory, and this time we'll take a look at our RDS setup. As you can see, it's the same look and feel. Everything feels and looks the same as the EC2 instance dashboard. The database we're looking to recover here is the Mabel Outlet DB instance. I've already assigned this to an SLA domain for us and already have some backups that we can play with. So if you remember our requirements at the beginning of this demo here, we want to be able to run this in US West 2. Currently it sits in US East 1. So let's go ahead and export a copy of this instance into US West 2. I'll just simply select the point in time that I want to export from the calendar view shown, and then I'll select Export from the list of recovery options. Now I just need to simply fill out the configuration that I want to apply to my restored database. I can go ahead and change the region. I can also change things like the database classes as well, or storage types. I'll just leave the defaults and click Next here, and now I need to select my desired VPC, and then select the database subnet group that I want to apply this to. Now, if I didn't have one here, I could easily go through a wizard to create a new one if need be. I'll go ahead and set up the options and the parameter groups as well, and point it to the desired security group that I want to apply to it. So this all looks good. Let's go ahead and finish up this wizard. And if we take a look at the events here, we can see that our database snapshot is actually already copying over to US West 2, and it will begin the restore process for us. So while that's running, let's go ahead and do the same with our EC2 instances. So I'll head back up to inventory, then select EC2 instances, and let me find the instance that provides the front end capabilities for our web store. It's this Mabel Outlet base. So we'll drill into it, and this time we get a couple of different recovery options, right? We have the ability to restore, which basically restores over top of the original EC2 instance to our selected point in time. But that said, we want to actually migrate this EC2 instance, so we're going to choose export, which basically allows us to create a new EC2 instance based off that point in time. Now, since this snapshot has actually already replicated as we configured within the SLA domain, we could select to use the replicated copy as our export source. This will save us the time of having to copy that snapshot over to the desired region before creation. So let's go ahead and select our new region here. In this case, it's going to be US West 2. And we'll specify a new key pair since it's in a different region, as well as point it to the proper VPC, subnet, and security groups. Now, by default, all the initial source tags are going to be applied to the new EC2 instance as well, and I'll show you why this might be of benefit once the restore is done. I'll go ahead and click Export to get this process started, and let's jump into the AWS console and actually check on our database restore. So through the magic of video, it looks like our database instance has actually exported, and it's up and running within the US West 2 region with all of those desired restore options that we defined. I'm going to just copy our database endpoint here, as we're going to need to change that within our store's configuration in order to point it to the newly restored database. So let's jump back into EC2 and check on that process. So it looks like our EC2 instance is done restoring as well. So let's go ahead and we'll SSH into this newly created EC2 instance, and we'll simply update the database information. I'll just modify the WP config file here containing the database information. We'll save that, and that's all we need to do. So I'll open up a new web browser here and head to our new IP of our exported instance. And we can see that we've successfully migrated our EC2 and RDS workloads over to the new region, and everything's up and running. Now, let's jump back into Rubric Polaris and take a look at the newly exported EC2 instance. We can see that it's actually been automatically protected by our SLA domain. And that's because we chose to export those tags along with the EC2 instance. So that environment prod rule actually applied to our restored instance as well. So now we can sleep better at night knowing that these things are basically automatically protected for us.
All right, so hopefully that demo highlighted some of the advantages that Rubric Polaris can bring and how easy it is to protect your AWS environment. We saw how we can simplify the job process, but with our SLAs and our automation. We took a look at how to provide recovery in the event of a region-level failure. We also showed tag rules and how they can drastically simplify the need for manual interaction when it comes to protecting your resources. And we got to look at the Managed Unified Data Management UI, which allows us to manage all of our data, whether it's on-prem, on the edge, or in the cloud. So with that, if you want to learn more about Rubric and our native AWS protection, I suggest taking a look at some of the links below. The architecture document and the how it works document is very, very technical. It goes really into the nitty-gritty details of how we architected the solution and how exactly it works. For the more visual learners, check out our YouTube video. We have tons of other demos of our AWS support and everything else. With that, thank you so much for watching. I'm Mike Preston, and please reach out if you have any questions. Thanks.